Vivid verses.
It is often said that the most significant architectural shifts begin with a single structural failure. For Ozias, a senior architectural consultant whose career was built on the precise calculation of load-bearing walls and the subtle psychology of spatial flow, that failure occurred on a Tuesday evening in a quiet, high-end suburb. The house was a mid-century modern gem, meticulously restored. Within its walls, every object existed as part of a curated narrative controlled by his wife, Michaela. Michaela, a boutique brand strategist, viewed their home not as a living space, but as a three-dimensional portfolio of her aesthetic discipline. Ozias had spent a decade navigating this landscape with the practiced ease of a man who understood that peace was often just a synonym for concession. He entered the foyer at 6:15 p.m. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his movements economical and deliberate. In his hand, he carried a vintage, leather-bound sketchbook, a $200 repository of drafting ideas and philosophical notes. He placed it on the mahogany sideboard near the entrance, a minor deviation from the entryway protocol Michaela had established to ensure the foyer remained visually silent. Michaela was in the kitchen, decanting a bottle of $90 Pinot Noir. She didn't look up, but Ozias saw the way her shoulders tightened. He recognized the stress indicator one, a micro-adjustment of her posture that signaled a perceived breach of order. "Ozias," she said, her voice a calm, practiced melody of disappointment. "The sideboard is a transitional surface for guests, not a storage unit for work artifacts." Ozias hung his coat in the closet, aligning the hanger at the mandatory 45-degree angle. "It's a sketchbook, Michaela. I'm heading to the study in 10 minutes. "It's a symptom," she countered, finally turning to face him. She was impeccably dressed in cream-colored silk, her hair a masterpiece of controlled waves. "Your lack of respect for the systems I've built is becoming an environmental toxin. If you can't maintain the discipline of this house, you shouldn't be occupying the primary spaces." Ozias observed her. He noted the slight dilation of her pupils. She was looking for a reaction, a spark of frustration she could label as aggressive, or a plea for forgiveness she could use as leverage. He gave her neither. "You're suggesting that the presence of a sketchbook on a sideboard constitutes a breach of our cohabitation agreement?" Ozias asked. His tone was light, genuinely curious, as if he were discussing a minor zoning ordinance. "I'm saying that until you learn the organizational rigor required to live here, you are banished from the master's suite," she declared, her chin tilting upward. "You can sleep in the den. Perhaps the proximity to the laundry room will inspire a better understanding of a place for everything." Ozias took a mental inventory of the den. It was a 10 by 10 room with a stiff sofa and no natural light. Then his mind drifted further back, past the kitchen, to the detached carriage house. It was a 600-square-foot structure that had been relegated to a catch-all for Michaela's abandoned hobbies. A $5,000 stationary bike she'd used twice, bins of seasonal decor, and stacks of inspirational design magazines from 2018. "The den feels a bit restrictive for the kind of deep organizational study you're suggesting," Ozias said, a slight, pleasant smile touching his lips. "I think the carriage house would be more appropriate. It has the volume required for a total, systemic reset." Michaela blinked. The script had been flipped. She had expected him to grumble about the den. She hadn't expected him to volunteer for exile in a dusty storage building. "The carriage house is a mess," she said, trying to regain the high ground. "Exactly," Ozias replied. "If I am to learn organization, I should start with the most chaotic variable on the property. It's only logical." He picked up his sketchbook. "I'll move my immediate essentials tonight. I wouldn't want to contaminate the master suite with my lack of rigor a moment longer." As he walked across the lawn toward the carriage house, Ozias felt a familiar sensation, the thrill of a new project. He wasn't angry. Anger was a waste of thermal energy. He was, however, deeply observant. He realized that Michaela's systems were actually a form of soft incarceration. She didn't want a partner. She wanted a prop that stayed in its assigned place. The carriage house smelled of cedar and neglected ambitions. Ozias flipped the light switch, revealing a sea of plastic bins. He stood in the center of the room and began to perform a real-time architectural audit. The slab is solid, poured concrete with no visible heaving. The rafters are exposed, giving me 10 feet of vertical clearance. The electrical subpanel is already rated for 60 amps. This isn't a garage. It's an unrefined luxury loft. The next morning, while Michaela was at her high-performance yoga class, Ozias made his first move. He didn't start with a broom. He started with a phone call to a professional removal service. "I need everything in this building hauled to a premium storage facility," he told the foreman. "I've already paid for a year's lease on a 20 by 20 unit. Here are the labels. If it doesn't have a label, it goes." By noon, the carriage house was empty. The cost of the removal and the storage lease was $4,200, a drop in the bucket of his personal discretionary fund, but a massive investment in his new mental real estate. When Michaela returned and saw the trucks, she stood on the back porch, her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. "What is happening?" she asked as the last of her artificial Christmas trees was loaded into the van. "Phase 1, site clearance," Ozias said, leaning against the doorframe of the carriage house. He looked relaxed, his sleeves rolled up, a digital measuring tape in his hand. "You were right, Michaela. The clutter was a distraction. To truly understand organization, I needed a vacuum, a blank slate. But my things are in a climate-controlled, high-security facility. I'll send you the digital access code. They are far more organized there than they were here." He watched her process this. She couldn't complain. He was literally doing what she had demanded, just at a scale she hadn't anticipated. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. "Well," she said, her voice thinning, "I hope you're planning to clean the floor. It's filthy. Infrastructure first, sanitation second," Ozias replied cheerfully. Over the next 2 weeks, Ozias operated with a quiet, devastating efficiency. He didn't work on the house. He worked on the space. He hired a high-end flooring contractor to grind the concrete and apply a metallic charcoal epoxy finish. A $6,500 job that made the floor look like liquid obsidian. He brought in an HVAC specialist to install a Mitsubishi mini-split system, ensuring the carriage house would maintain a perfect 68 degrees regardless of the humidity outside. He worked his normal job during the day, managing a $40 million waterfront development. The stress of the multi-million-dollar project felt lighter now that his evenings were spent in a sanctuary of his own design. Michaela would occasionally wander out, her presence like a cold front moving through a warm valley. She would look at the new recessed LED lighting, color-calibrated for optimal circadian rhythm, and the way the walls have been finished in a soft, matte gallery white. "This seems like a lot of effort for a temporary lesson," she remarked one evening, holding a green juice like a scepter. "Organization isn't a temporary state. It's a lifestyle," Ozias said. He was currently reviewing a set of blueprints for a custom-built walnut cabinetry unit that would house his coffee station and a hidden bar. "I'm learning that when the environment is optimized, the mind follows. I've never been more productive. And when are you coming back to the house?" Ozias didn't look up from his tablet. He noted the slight tremor in her voice. "She's losing the anchor of the relationship," he deduced. "She needs me back in the house, so she can exert the pressure that makes her feel stable." "I'm still in the foundational phase," he said. "It would be premature to return before the system is fully stress-tested." I wouldn't want to disappoint you by relapsing into my old, chaotic ways. By week 4, the carriage house was no longer a garage. It was a jewel box of modern design. Ozias had spent roughly $25,000 on the renovation, including a custom-built Murphy bed that folded into the wall behind a series of seamless walnut panels. He had a $4,000 ergonomic chair, a motorized standing desk, and a sound system that delivered concert hall quality audio. He had also installed a compact but professional-grade kitchenette. The centerpiece was a $3,000 La Marzocco espresso machine. He no longer went into the main house for coffee. He no longer went into the main house for anything other than his mail and the occasional formal dinner they were obligated to host. One Friday, he invited his brother, Dylan, and their mutual friend, Jimmy, over for a site inspection. Dylan was a private equity analyst, and Jimmy was a high-end landscape architect. Both men were intimately familiar with the Michaela protocol, having spent years watching Ozias navigate her minefield of expectations. When they stepped into the carriage house, the silence was broken only by the low hum of the climate control. "Holy hell," Dylan said, running a hand over the polished concrete. "Ozias, this isn't a punishment. This is an upgrade. It's an organizational project," Ozias said, a glint of humor in his eyes. He handed each of them a glass of 18-year-old scotch, poured from a decanter that sat on his new walnut sideboard. "She kicked you out for a sketchbook, and you built a bachelor's paradise?" Jimmy laughed, settling into the leather armchair. "You realize this is the greatest move in the history of domestic warfare, right?" "It's not warfare," Ozias corrected, leaning back against his desk. "Warfare implies an emotional reaction. This is simply a relocation of assets. Michaela wanted a house that was a museum of her own taste. I provided her with that. In exchange, I've claimed a territory where I can exist as a three-dimensional human being." "How's she taking it?" Dylan asked. "She's confused," Ozias said. "She tries to gaslight me every few days, telling me the neighbors are talking or that I'm being emotionally unavailable. I simply agree with her. I tell her that she was right all along, that I was clearly unfit for her standards and that I need more time to rehabilitate my habits. It's impossible to argue with someone who is constantly agreeing with your original premise." As the night progressed, the three men talked about life, business, and the subtle ways they had all compromised their identities for the sake of domestic peace. In the carriage house, under the warm glow of the LED strips, the conversation was honest, loud, and unfiltered. There were no visual sanctity protocols to follow. There was no tone monitoring. At 10 p.m., a sharp knock echoed on the door. It was Michaela. She was dressed in a black cocktail dress, looking as if she were ready for a gala, though they had nowhere to go. "Ozias, it's late. The noise is carrying to the bedroom." Ozias looked at his decibel meter on the wall. "Actually, we're at 55 decibels, Michaela. That's roughly the volume of a quiet conversation. Given the R30 insulation I've installed, the sound transfer to the main house should be virtually non-existent." He didn't move toward the door. He didn't apologize. He simply offered her a clinical observation. "It's the fact of the noise," she said, her voice rising. "It's the fact that you're out here drinking and laughing while I'm in there alone." Ozias thought. The core issue. It's not about the noise. It's about the loss of the audience. She can't perform her role as the perfect manager if the employee has checked out. "You're always welcome to join us, Michaela," Ozias said, though they all knew she wouldn't. "But keep in mind, this space is organized around my specific social needs. It might not meet your aesthetic protocols." She looked at the three men, Dylan and Jimmy, watching her with a mixture of pity and amusement, and she realized she had no leverage. She had banished him, and he had made himself a king in his exile. She turned and walked back to the house, the click of her heels on the pavement sounding frantic. "You're in trouble now," Jimmy whispered. "No," Ozias said, taking a sip of his scotch. "I'm in control. There's a difference." By week 8, the organizational project had become a permanent lifestyle. Ozias had established a routine that was so efficient it bordered on the sublime. He woke at 5:30 a.m., used his rowing machine, showered in the compact but high-pressure rainfall shower he'd installed, and was at his desk by 7 a.m. His billable hours had increased by 20%. His stress levels had plummeted. Michaela's tactics had shifted from indignation to a desperate kind of reconciliation. She began bringing him peace offerings, organic smoothies, high-end magazines, even a new, even more expensive sketchbook. "I think you've learned your lesson, Ozias," she said one evening, standing in the doorway of the carriage house. "The house feels empty without you. I've decided to forgive the sideboard incident. You can move back in tomorrow." Ozias looked at her. He saw the way she was clutching her elbows, the way her eyes scanned his perfect, private sanctuary with a hunger she couldn't hide. "I appreciate the offer, Michaela. Truly," he said. He was sitting in his leather chair, a set of architectural plans spread out before him. "But I've been analyzing the data, and I've realized that our shared systems were actually highly inefficient. By living in separate quarters, we've eliminated 90% of our domestic friction. I don't have to worry about my sketchbooks, and you don't have to worry about your visual sanctity. It's a win-win." "It's not a win-win. We're married, Ozias. We're supposed to sleep in the same bed. Because of tradition? Or because it's a more organized way to live?" he asked. "Because from a functional standpoint, I'm sleeping better, working better, and I'm much more organized than I've ever been. I thought that was the goal." "You're being a robot," she screamed, her composure finally shattering. Ozias didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply waited for the echo of her scream to die down in the acoustically treated room. "A robot follows instructions without questioning the intent," he said softly. "I questioned the intent. I realized the intent wasn't organization, it was compliance. And while I'm happy to be organized, I'm no longer interested in being compliant." She stood there, panting, her perfect manager, mask lying in pieces on the polished floor. "If you don't come back to the house tonight, I'm calling a lawyer," she threatened. Ozias nodded slowly. "That seems like a logical next step in our organizational journey. In fact, I've already taken the liberty of consulting with one. His name is Marcus. He specializes in high-asset systemic decouplings. I'll have his office send over the preliminary paperwork on Monday." The silence that followed was absolute. "You want a divorce?" she whispered. "I want a life that isn't a performance," Ozias said. "I want a home where I can leave a book on a table without being treated like a criminal. You want a home that is a static museum. We both deserve to have what we want, but we can't have both in the same house." The next 2 weeks were a study in logistical precision. Ozias didn't move back into the house. Instead, he began looking at luxury condos in the city. He found a 2,000-square-foot loft with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. It was a space that required no renovation. It was already perfect. He handled the divorce proceedings with the same calm, observant discipline that he applied to his drafting. When Michaela tried to claim that he had abandoned the marriage, he produced a meticulous log of the organizational protocols she had forced upon him, including the text where she had explicitly banned him from the bedroom. The client, my wife, initiated a spatial restriction protocol, Ozias explained to the mediator. "I simply complied with the client's request and optimized the secondary site. The eventual dissolution of the contract was a natural result of the site's successful independence." The mediator, a grizzled man who had seen everything, looked at Ozias with a mix of awe and confusion. "So, She kicked you out for a sketchbook, and you used that as a springboard to build a separate life? I used it as a data point, Ozias corrected. The data point suggested that the partnership had a fatal structural flaw. I chose to mitigate the risk before the entire building collapsed. Michaela walked away with the house, the museum she so dearly loved. Ozias walked away with his liquid assets, his career, and his sanity. On his final day at the property, Ozias stood in the carriage house, which was now empty once again. He had sold the furniture to a colleague and had his electronics moved to the new loft. He looked at the polished concrete floors, the walnut panels, and the perfect lighting. Michaela came out to see him off. She looked tired. The house behind her was perfect. Every cushion was plumped, every surface was clear, every system was in place. And she was entirely alone in it. I still don't understand how you could do this, she said. Over a book. Ozias adjusted his glasses. It was never about the book, Michaela. It was about the fact that you thought you could use order as a cage. You taught me a very valuable lesson about organization. The most important thing to organize is your own freedom. He got into his car, a silver Porsche he'd recently treated himself to, and drove away without looking back. 6 months later, Ozias was sitting in a high-end bistro in the city, waiting for a dinner guest. The restaurant was small, intimate, and designed with a brutalist elegance he admired. He was reading a new book on sustainable urban design. He looked up as a woman approached the table. Her name was Amira, a structural engineer he'd met on a recent project. She was intelligent, quick-witted, and possessed a chaotic energy that he found surprisingly refreshing. As she sat down, she accidentally bumped her heavy leather bag against the table, knocking over the salt shaker. "Oh, damn," she said, laughing as she quickly uprighted it. "I'm a disaster in small spaces. Sorry about the mess." Ozias looked at the scattered grains of salt on the dark wood table. He looked at the bag sitting haphazardly on the floor. Then he looked at Amira, whose smile was genuine and unburdened by expectations. "It's just salt," Ozias said, closing his book. "In the grand scheme of the room's architecture, it's a negligible variable." "You're not going to make me clean it up?" she joked. "I think we can find a way to live with it," Ozias replied, his voice warm. "In fact, I find the lack of symmetry quite charming." As they ordered dinner, Ozias realized that he had finally achieved the ultimate level of organization. He had organized a life where he was no longer a prop, where his frame was built of his own confidence rather than someone else's restrictions. He thought briefly of Michaela, sitting in her perfect, silent house, perhaps adjusting a vase by 2 millimeters to the left. He felt no malice toward her, only a mild, professional interest in how one could spend so much time maintaining a structure that contained nothing of value. He took a sip of his wine, leaned back, and enjoyed the beautiful, disorganized hum of the world around him. He had learned his lesson well. Everything was exactly where it belonged. He was here, the salt was on the table, and the door to the cage was miles behind him, rusting in the sun.
Thanks for listening.